You didn't choose silence to win. You chose it because nothing you said ever seemed to land. Not when you were clear, not when you were vulnerable, not even when your voice cracked from holding back everything you couldn't name. Silence wasn't a tactic. It was the moment you realized that speaking felt like begging, and you were done begging. There comes a moment in every man's life when he looks at himself in the mirror and doesn't recognize the sound of his own voice. Not because it changed, but because it was never truly heard. That moment breaks something, or maybe it wakes something. You stop chasing closure. You stop explaining yourself to someone who already decided not to understand. And for the first time in a long time, you stop talking. Not because you've got nothing left to say, but because you finally understand that silence speaks louder than self-betrayal. Zeno of Citium knew what it meant to lose everything. His shipwreck didn't just destroy his possessions. It stripped him of who he thought he was. But he didn't curse the sea. He didn't scream at the horizon. He walked the ruins and listened. And in that silence, a new voice formed. Not louder, but deeper. Not public, but inward. That's what silence does. It doesn't abandon you. It shows you who you are when there's no one left to perform for. Seneca once said, "Speech is not a virtue in itself, only when it serves what is wise." There's no honor in constant explaining. There's no dignity in defending your heart to someone who uses your truth as ammunition. Your silence isn't a gap. It's a boundary, a line drawn in stillness saying, "I will not lose myself just to keep you close." And that line, that's what she remembers when you stop speaking. Here's what most don't understand. Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything she refused to see when you were giving her access to all of you. Psychology confirms it. The human mind fixates on uncertainty. When the expected voice disappears, the mind loops. The questions grow, and curiosity becomes obsession. That's the paradox. You stop showing up, and suddenly you're everywhere. But this isn't revenge. This isn't manipulation. This isn't you playing games. It's you reclaiming space. Your space. Your center. It's you remembering that being heard doesn't mean being loud. It means being rooted. Your silence becomes a mirror, and while you rebuild in stillness, she's forced to face her own noise. This isn't about getting her back. It's about coming back to yourself. No drama, no performance, just presence, just stillness, just the sound of a man who finally understood that not every fire deserves fuel, and not every woman deserves access to your voice. Because silence isn't the absence of love. It's the return of self-respect, and that, more than anything, is what makes her stop and stare and wonder. Now the silence isn't between you, it's inside her, and that's where the obsession begins. There was a time when you believed your words could fix it. You explained, you apologized, you overcommunicated, thinking that if she just understood you, everything would settle. But the more you spoke, the less you were heard. The louder your emotions got, the quieter your presence became. Until one day, the words dried up, not from bitterness, but from wisdom. You realized, nothing changes until you stop performing. She doesn't remember every word you said. She remembers when you stopped trying to be understood. That shift, that silence, it wasn't an absence, it was gravity. Suddenly, the man who always filled the space with explanations just vanished. Not physically, emotionally, spiritually. Your presence remained, but your need to be validated didn't, and that's when the air changed. In masculine psychology, silence is not retreat, it's return. A man in silence becomes a man in command, not of others, of himself. He doesn't argue, he doesn't convince, he doesn't chase, he just stands still. And in that stillness, everything weak begins to tremble, because stillness reveals power. Stillness reveals what noise was hiding. Modern neuroscience agrees the human brain reacts most strongly to what it can't predict. Silence, when it's real, becomes a question she can't answer, a doorway she can't close, a presence she can't explain away. And that unknown, it replaces the comfort of control with the unease of reflection. When you stop proving, she starts remembering. The texture of your discipline, the weight of your restraint. The man who once explained his pain is now a shadow walking silently through her mind. That's how you shift, not through confrontation, through refusal. Refusal to repeat yourself, refusal to prove your worth, refusal to keep holding the rope she let go of long ago. And that refusal, that's what makes you rare. Because most men talk until they lose themselves. But a stoic man, He disappears in silence and reappears in presence. You were told to communicate, to be transparent, to open up more. So you did. You broke your own silence in the name of intimacy, thinking it would bring closeness. But all it did was make you easier to reach and easier to disregard. Because when every feeling is voiced, when every insecurity is laid bare without boundary, what once felt solid becomes soft. What once commanded attention becomes background noise. Most men weren't raised to be heard. They were raised to keep peace. So when a woman asks for more words, he delivers, not from presence, but from pressure. And in doing so, he starts to dissolve. He talks not to express truth, but to prove worth. And the more he explains, the less magnetic he becomes. Because verbal pursuit, no matter how sincere, quietly says, "I'll do anything to stay close." And that energy doesn't invite respect, it invites retreat. Silence, on the other hand, doesn't beg to be kept. It doesn't perform. It doesn't chase. It stays. And in staying still, it holds its ground. That's why silence restores polarity. Because true masculine presence doesn't collapse into comfort. It stays rooted in containment. Not cold, not detached, but unfazed. Polarity lives in this contrast. The man who can feel deeply but doesn't need to speak to prove it. Zeno didn't teach that the world should hear us more. He taught that clarity comes when we first hear ourselves. And when a man is aligned with that internal compass, he no longer needs to narrate his pain. He embodies it. He holds it without broadcasting it. That containment, quiet, dignified, immovable, is what reignites polarity. Not because he withholds love, but because he no longer trades it for belonging. And in that space, something shifts. The woman who once heard everything now hears nothing. And in that nothing, she feels the weight of everything he used to say. Not as words, as presence. It doesn't start with missing you. It starts with not being able to read you. The man who once explained everything now says nothing. No texts, no late-night justifications, no emotional check-ins. Just silence. Not empty, but full. Full of boundaries, full of dignity, full of the version of you she never thought would stop knocking. That's when it begins. The inner questioning, the revaluation. Not because you shouted, begged, or reminded her of your worth, but because your absence created space for her to feel the impact of your presence. She wonders, not just where you are, but who you've become, and more importantly, why you no longer need her to see you. Obsession doesn't arise when you stay visible. It emerges when you vanish with calmness. When you no longer need to correct the story she tells herself. When you stop bleeding emotions into a space that never held them. That vacuum, the one she used to fill with her own sense of control, now echoes with unanswered questions. And questions always carry more weight than answers. Evolutionary psychology tells us something the Stoics already knew. Uncertainty breeds fixation. The unpredictable male presence triggers something ancient. The fear of losing what she assumed was already hers. But this isn't about fear. It's about her finally sitting in the silence you once sat in alone. The silence she dismissed. The silence she used to control the tempo. Now that silence is hers. You didn't disappear to provoke her. You simply stopped handing her access to every emotion you used to place at her feet. And in that decision, something shifted. She no longer sees the man who waited. She sees the man who let go. And for the first time, she doesn't know how to reach him. That not knowing, it's not punishment. It's the beginning of consequence. Quiet, dignified, inevitable. There's a difference between being quiet and being at peace. One is a performance, the other is a return. Many men fall into the trap of using silence as a move, something to provoke, to control, to spark reaction. But that kind of silence is brittle. It doesn't hold. It breaks the man who carries it. Because deep down, he's still waiting for validation in the echo. If you're silent just to make her chase you, you haven't walked away. You've just changed your costume. It's still performance, still dependence, still hoping she sees your worth through absence, instead of reclaiming that worth in solitude. That kind of silence is loud with expectation. It's not stoicism, it's suppressed desperation. Real silence, the kind that shifts you, is not a strategy. It's a state. It doesn't say, "Notice me." It says, "I've noticed myself." Marcus Aurelius didn't withhold emotion to manipulate anyone. He withheld reaction to protect what was sacred inside. That's the point. Stoic silence isn't about denying your pain. It's about refusing to spill it where it won't be held with respect. When silence is authentic, it anchors you. It heals you. It makes you whole. But when silence is faked, it fractures you. It turns you into a ghost, chasing your own reflection. You check your phone. You wait for the message. You look for signs that she noticed. And in doing so, you reveal that you haven't detached. You've just paused your performance. The silence that changes you is the one you don't use. It's the one that arises when words no longer serve you, when your peace matters more than being right, when your energy is too sacred to be thrown into arguments that only recycle the same wound. That silence doesn't chase. It doesn't test. It just is. And from that stillness, you rise, not to provoke, but to protect, not to punish, but to preserve. And in that preservation, you remember, your peace was never hers to disrupt. She was used to your voice, not just the words, but the access, the emotional availability, the consistent explanations, the way you showed up to clarify what you felt, even when she dismissed it. That rhythm of her pulling away and you pulling closer became her security, not because it healed anything, but because it told her she still had control. And then it stopped. The first time she feels it, she might not name it, but she feels it. A shift, an absence of what used to be predictable. You're no longer filling the space. You're no longer answering the unspoken demand to prove your worth. And in that space, a fracture appears, not in you, but in her narrative of you. The man who once echoed her moods with empathy now reflects nothing but presence. And that contradiction creates dissonance. Psychological dissonance is not confusion. It's a tension between what someone expects and what they experience. And for a woman used to your emotional transparency, your grounded silence becomes disorienting. It activates questions she didn't think she'd need to ask. Why did he change? Why is he calm? What does he know that I don't? Silence, in this way, becomes not absence, but presence with weight, with edge, with consequence. You no longer provide her with a script. No cues, no apologies, no explanations. And when she tries to provoke the old version of you, the reactive one, she finds only stillness. That stillness removes the map. It forces her to navigate without the usual signs. She doesn't know what you're thinking. More importantly, she doesn't know what you're feeling. And that unknown becomes louder than any argument could have been. But this silence isn't cold. It's not punishment. It's not revenge. It's discipline. And that discipline shakes her, because it shows that you're no longer playing the role. You're no longer responding on cue. You've left the stage. And now, the silence is hers to interpret. And the longer it lingers, the more it disturbs the story she told herself about who you were. Not because you changed overnight, but because you finally stopped explaining why you stayed. Every time you explained your silence, you softened its edge. Every message sent to clarify your distance only reminded her that you hadn't truly left, that you were still available for interpretation, still needing to be seen, to be justified, to be received. But real silence doesn't seek to be understood, it seeks to be honored. Explanation, no matter how honest, becomes erosion. Each word chips away at the boundary you tried to build. You think you're helping her see your side, but what you're really doing is placing the weight back on your shoulders, again, carrying the emotional labor, again, making sure she's okay with your truth, again. And in doing so, you become her therapist instead of her mirror. The masculine doesn't exist to be decoded. It exists to be felt, not through noise, but through steadiness. Chrysippus taught that reason, not reaction, was the guide. That restraint, not explanation, revealed a man's true measure. When you stop translating your silence into justifications, you force her to sit with what you once shielded her from, the impact of her own behavior, the absence of your approval, the weight of your exit. She won't reevaluate because you asked her to. She'll reevaluate because your absence leaves no distractions, because your stillness offers no comfort, because your silence becomes louder than your voice ever did. And in that echo, she has to face what you never said, that your worth was never hers to validate. There's a story she starts telling herself, not because you corrected her, but because you didn't. The man who used to chase is now a closed door, not locked, just no longer open. And that stillness, it changes the story. You didn't argue, you didn't accuse, you didn't return. And that absence, that calm, immovable absence, it rewrites everything. She doesn't remember the day you stopped talking. She remembers the day your silence made her listen. She doesn't fear losing the man who begged. She fears losing the man who no longer needs to explain himself. The man who used to stay in rooms that drained him just to prove he was good enough. He's gone. What remains is someone quieter, not colder, just less available to things that once devoured his spirit. Stoic masculinity doesn't teach through lectures. It teaches through contrast, through stillness, through walking away without slamming the door. Your silence becomes a syllabus, a lesson she never expected, one that doesn't shout, doesn't punish, doesn't try to control. It simply stands, and in that standing, she sees the consequence of what she once overlooked. You didn't stop speaking because you wanted her to suffer. You stopped because you refused to keep bleeding where there was no healing. That decision wasn't pride, it was clarity. You saw what you were becoming, and you chose to stop the erosion. That is self-respect, not in theory, in practice. In the quiet way you now move through your life without seeking applause for the boundaries you finally enforced. She may not understand it at first. She might even call it cold, distant, or unfair. But that's only because she can no longer reach you where she once had full access. And that limitation feels like loss, not because you disappeared, but because she can't find the old version of you, the one who needed her attention to feel whole. This isn't rejection, it's calibration. It's the resetting of your emotional compass. You no longer offer yourself in exchange for scraps of affection. You no longer abandon your center to keep the peace, and in that grounded silence, something sacred returns, not just to you, but to the space around you. The more deeply you root in your silence, the louder your worth becomes. Not in words, in energy, in posture, in the unwavering presence of a man who no longer needs to be chosen to feel complete. She learns, or she repeats the lesson elsewhere. But either way, your silence remains the teacher, and dignity remains the final word. Zeno didn't rebuild his life by shouting into the waves. He rebuilt it by listening to the silence. In losing everything, he found something far more permanent than possessions. He found philosophy, a way of living that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, and doesn't need to be seen to hold value. That's what your silence becomes. Not emptiness, direction. Epictetus once said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." But it goes deeper than that. We are built to observe, to withstand, to reflect. Because not every battle needs a sword, some only require stillness, especially the ones within. And when you stop mistaking reaction for relevance, you stop wasting your voice on those who were never listening to begin with. She doesn't obsess because she lost control over you. She obsesses because you reclaimed control over yourself. And in doing so, you disappeared. Not in anger, not in pain, but in presence. You became a locked door in a hallway she thought she owned. And now, every step she takes toward that door echoes with what she used to take for granted. You didn't go silent to be heard. You went silent because bleeding out your emotions became too costly. You went silent because staying loud started to feel like self-betrayal. You went silent because something inside you remembered. Peace is not passive, it's chosen. And sometimes the most powerful thing a man can say is nothing at all. And that silence, that's what she hears now. Every day, every night. Not the sound of you leaving, but the absence of the man who used to stay.